Hello, everyone, and good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. And thank you for joining our August member-only lecture with Dr. Solange Ashby, titled The Goddess Isis and the Kingdom of Meroe. I'm Dr. Louise Bertini, and I'm the Executive Director of the American Research Center in Egypt. For some brief updates from RC, our next podcast episode will be released on September 4th, featuring Dr. Nozumu Kawai of Kanazawa University, titled Tutankhamun's Court. This episode will discuss the political situation during the reign of King Tutankhamun and highlight influential officials in his court. It will also discuss the building program during his reign and the possible motives behind it. As for upcoming events, our next public lecture will be on September 13th and is titled The Karaites in Egypt, the Preservation of Egyptian Jewish Heritage. This lecture will feature a panel of speakers, including Jonathan Cohen, Ambassador of the United States of America to the Arab Republic of Egypt, Magda Haroun, Head of the Egyptian Jewish Community, Dr. Yoram Matal, Professor of Middle East Studies at Ben-Gurion University, as well as myself representing RC to discuss the efforts in the preservation of the historic Basatine Cemetery in Cairo. Our next member-only lecture will be on September 20th with Dr. Jose Galan of the Spanish National Research Council in Madrid, titled A Middle Kingdom Funerary Garden in Thebes. You can find out more about our member-only and public lecture series schedule on our website, rc.org. So with that, I'm now going to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Solange Ashby received her PhD in Egyptology with a specialization in ancient Egyptian language and Nubian religion from the University of Chicago. She has researched in Egypt at the Temple of Feli and participated in an archaeological excavation at El Kourou in Sudan. Her first book, Calling Out to Isis, The Enduring Nubian Presence at Feli, was released in July by Georgia's Press. Her current research explores the role of women in traditional Nubian religious practices. Dr. Ashby is working on the first monograph dedicated to the history, religious symbolism, and political power of the Queens of Kush. So now I am turning it over to Dr. Ashby. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Greetings, everyone from Washington, D.C. I'd like to thank the American Research Center in Egypt for inviting me to talk to you today about the goddess Isis and the kingdom of Maraway. We know that Feli is a Ptolemaic temple, that it continued to function long after other temples in Egypt had fallen into disuse. Roman rulers no longer funded the temple cult as Egyptian pharaohs had for millennia. We know that Isis was the principal deity worshipped at Feli, and that Lower Nubia had been granted to Isis as her estate. What is less known, despite the overwhelming archaeological and textual evidence, is that Feli is a Nubian sacred space. My doctoral research focused on Nubian prayer inscriptions in all of the temples of Lower Nubia. And what I found dramatically altered the way that I understand the temple economy of the region and the pious worshipers who frequented the temples between Feli and Dhaka along the Nile. The image on the lower left of your screen is one of many figural graffiti found at Feli. This one decorates the western exterior face of the Gate of Hadrian, one of the principal areas in which Nubian inscriptions are found. Here are two images of the temples at Feli. The image on the left I took when approaching the island by boat on the western side. You'll note the two monumental gateways here and here, the first pylon and the second pylon. Between the two gateways is the birth house dedicated to Isis and Horus as mother and child. And then jetting out behind the second pylon is the temple, the main temple on the island dedicated to the goddess Isis. I'd like to also point out this small structure coming out from the west side of the temple that is the Gate of Hadrian, and I will return to talk about this later in the lecture. On the right, you see a photo of the dromos, or the forecourt of the Temple of Isis, with that first pylon in the background. Colonnades line both sides of this open area. The eastern colonnade here and the western colonnade here. This area includes several small temples dedicated to Nubian gods, Arns Nufis, Mondalis, and Thoth Panubs. The earliest Nubian inscriptions are found on structures in this area, notably the west colonnade and the doorway through the first pylon. I'll also make reference later in this lecture to epic parties thrown by the Nubian visitors as they arrived at Feli, and those parties would have taken place on the dromos, or the forecourt of Feli. The Greek inscription that I will discuss in the next slide was engraved on the western side of the front of the first pylon shown here. This was not a Nubian inscription. It was an undated Greek inscription describing the spectacle of Nubian boats arriving at Feli to perform the religious rituals that they came to undertake on an annual basis. And so the inscription reads, "Having arrived at the island, the limits of Egypt, most beautiful holy place of Isis in the face of Ethiopia, we saw in the river Nile fast sailing ships which carried the Ethiopian shrines worthy of the gods to our land." So my dissertation research into these Nubian inscriptions in the Dodecaskoinos revealed that there were three discrete phases of Nubian epigraphic presence at these temples. The dates of the phases of these inscriptions are based on the rare dates that were actually included in the text of the inscriptions, and on family relationships between people mentioned in various inscriptions. As you can see on the bottom right, there are a total of 94 Nubian inscriptions that are securely, that we can securely say were authored by Nubians. These were based on three factors: the presence of Nubian names that were clearly not Egyptian, names such as Rake, Mani, Abli, Suni, Selwa, Bekameti, and Manatawi, or the presence in the inscriptions of Marowitic language titles such as Shashameti, Karen, or Hebhen, and also from time to time a reference to travel from Maraway. The predominance of Demotic as the language of choice in all three phases of these Nubian inscriptions indicates the assimilation of the Nubian priests and officials into the Egyptian temple hierarchy and their respect for tradition. While the sizable number of Marowitic language inscriptions attest to the direct involvement of Marowitic royalty in the temple cult and administration at Feli, and the prestige awarded to the Merowitic language even after that kingdom fell circa 330 CE. Only two Greek inscriptions are attested in the second phase of inscriptions, but by the third phase of inscriptions, almost 40% of the corpus was written in the Greek language. The kingdom of Maraway had fallen by that time, and Greek had become the language of communication between Nubians who spoke different languages in the 5th century CE. The Blemis who arrived into the Nile Valley from the eastern desert, and the Nubade who came down into the Nile Valley from the Nuba Mountains. Nubia is located in the Middle Nile Valley between the first and the fourth cataracts. Feli Temple is located at the first cataract, and the sacred site of Jebel Barkal is at the fourth cataract, which is also the site of the capital of the Kushite kings of Egypt's 25th dynasty. These two sites, Feli in the north and Jebel Barkal in the south, bracket the land of Nubia. Maraway, capital of Kush, during the period in which these Nubian inscriptions were engraved, is located just north of the sixth cataract. If you look at the map on the right, I'll describe the different areas that writers of these three separate phases of Nubian inscriptions came from. So the phase one inscriptions are attested in the widest geographical range of temples. The prominent strategos named Abli, and his title strategos probably refers to, in this case, as him being the occult association president. Abli is attested twice in inscriptions at Feli, once at the temple of Kalabsha, and then again at the temple of Dhaka. And so all along the temples that line the Nile throughout the area, referred to as the Dodekaskoinos, this 120-kilometer area between Feli in the north and Maharaka in the south. This changes in the second phase of Nubian inscriptions when the priestly family, referred to as Waiakia, several members of the family had this name, come into prominence. This family, the Waiakia family, is based at Sayala, so immediately south of the southern border of the Dodekaskoinos. They're now located in Marowitic controlled Nubia. At Sayala, in fact, their funerary monuments inscribed in the Merowitic language have been found in a small town called Medik. But they're also attested at a site called Jebel Ada that is unfortunately off this map, but located about 5 kilometers south of Abu Simbel in the vicinity of Balana and Kustul, which would come to be important centers for the X group in the post-Merowitic period. Now, in the third phase of the Nubian inscription, we see a shift to the south for practitioners of this traditional Nile Valley religion. And so we do have inscriptions at Feli showing that priests did arrive at Feli and inscribe their prayer inscriptions. But there are also inscriptions from the temple of Tafa at Kalabsha, which during this period was a religious stronghold of the Blemi people. And then also far south in Kasri Bream, where the remains of an amazing temple of Isis have been excavated there. And fortunately preserved, because Kasri Bream was on a mountain. It's now an island in Lake Nasser. During this third phase, the Blemi priest negotiated a settlement to provide that they would continue to have access to the divine statue of Isis from Feli, so that this statue could be taken back to Nubia annually as a procession to visit the shrines of this goddess located throughout Nubia. So here is a plan of Feli showing the location of the inscriptions from phase one. You can see that they are only located along that dromos, the forecourt area, no access to the interior of the Temple of Isis itself. These inscriptions record specifically agreements, and they are recording promises to arrive with donations and then spell out the apportionment of these mandatory temple donations brought by Nubian cult associations from the surrounding towns immediately surrounding the Temple of Feli, and how they would be divided amongst temple personnel, for example, temple singers, or donated directly to the Temple of Arns-Nufis, for example, located here. In this phase, local Nubians were functioning in an Egyptian, in this case, Roman Egyptian dominated context, and they came to deliver their tithes to Feli as mandated during the preceding reign of the Ptolemies in Egypt. 10% of all the produce of Nubia was to be brought to the temple of Isis and donated there. And this is stipulated in Nubian nome reliefs and hieroglyphic inscriptions found in this passageway through the first pylon on the Dodekaskoinos stela standing in front of the second pylon, and the interior of this area in the first pylon. Some of the examples of offerings that Nubians were required at this point to bring to the temple are wheat, wine, wool, and above all, gold. These people who inscribed the inscriptions came to worship Nubian gods, Arns-Nufis and Thoth-Panubs. At this early phase, phase one, they were not apparently temple priests, but rather cult association members. And it seems that they could not read or write Demotic during this early phase. Here's some images from the Dromos at Feli, where it's spelled out very clearly in the accompanying hieroglyphic text that Arns-Nufis here, we're told Eem Taseti, so he comes from Taseti, Nubia. And then Thoth-Panubs depicted here is said to be M Ta Nehesi, so an area further south in Nubia, probably, most certainly located at the area called Panubs, Panebes, which is the name of the sacred jujubir tree that was excavated and found in the sacred circular enclosure at Kerma. So this is a plan, again, of this forecourt area. I just want to point out these temples to Nubian gods, Mondelez here, and Osiris together with Arns-Nufis in this temple. Cruz Uribe has proposed that the kiosk of Nectanebo, not shown on this plan, was consecrated as a shrine of Thoth-Panubs. This area was expanded during the Roman period to accommodate the crowds of Nubians who arrived here, and created, in fact, a forecourt for the temple of Arns-Nufis. Note columns 9 and 10 located here in the western colonnade. This architrave, located above columns 9 and 10 of the western colonnade, creates a doorway facing Biga Island to the west of Feli. Biga Island, of course, being the site of the burial of Osiris. A Nubian inscription, Feli 24, engraved on the eastern face of column 9, refers to Pashel and Yiri Hemes Nefer, which I have translated as the doorway of Arns-Nufis, probably referring to this very space in the image on the lower right. And I've used the old Nubian word shal to translate the difficult Demotic term which Griffith rendered as tooth, as in tooth of Arns-Nufis, and Cruz Uribe translated as spike, the spike of Arns-Nufis, neither of which seem to make sense in this context. So moving on to phase 2 of Nubian inscriptions, circa 175 to 275 CE. We can see that the Nubian inscriptions have now moved into the restricted area of the temple. And I'll just point out the three major foci of Nubian inscriptions during this second phase. The Marowitic chamber here behind the second eastern colonnade, and I'll show you an image on the next slide. This southwest corner of the pronaos, which is formed as the back of the second pylon, and then that gate of Hadrian, which I showed you in that original picture of Feli. Nubians in this period claim the highest religious titles, Hemnecher priest and Wab priest, while also claiming Marowitic priestly and administrative titles, Karen of Isis, Agent of Isis, King's Son of Cush, and the Royal Scribe of Cush. Those two latter titles indicating that they were in the employ of Merowitic royalty. They also claim in their inscriptions knowledge of the movement of the stars, so astronomical knowledge. One priest, Waiakia A, in his Graffito Fili 421, claims the title Hemnecher priest of Sopdet and priest of the 5 living planets. Those are the 5 planets visible to the naked eye: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And I imagine that they use this astronomical knowledge to determine when would be the appropriate time to arrive at Fili to perform rites on behalf of the rulers in Maraway. These were very high-ranking priests and political emissaries who arrived at Fili with donations of gold sent by the rulers in Maraway. And these priests, the Nubian priests, were welcomed with honor by the Egyptian priests, their colleagues. Here's an image of the decoration of the interior of the Marowitic chamber. Unfortunately, this is no longer decorating the walls of that chamber, as it was painted onto the stone as opposed to engraved in it. So we see 2 processions of Marowitic priests and dignitaries starting here from inscription 97 and going back. This inscription went from the center of the north wall of the chamber and along the western wall, while the second procession meets again in the center of that north wall and then wraps around the eastern wall of the Marowitic chamber. You'll note that these dignitaries are carrying palm staves, which is also a feature of the decoration of Marowitic funerary chapels. And each individual is accompanied by a Marowitic language text, which lets us know the name of some of these individuals: Mashtarake, Bekamete, Apamalo, and Manutawawi. The second and third individuals being members of the Waiakia family. The others are not securely connected to that family, but probably were also members of this dominant Nubian family of priests. Their titles that we get from the Merowitic text let us know that they held Merowitic titles such as Hebhen, Kroro, Strategus of the water, Strategus of the land, Korin of Isis, so that would be the very same title that is transcribed into Demotic as Karen, and then Agent of Isis. And I make reference here to the Feast of Entry. What I'm finding through the inscriptions is frequent references to an Ak procession, which seems to be a funerary procession performed for Osiris, as he was understood to be one with the deceased Merowitic king. And so these Nubian priests came to perform funerary rites for their king by performing this Ak procession. So this inscription, inscribed on the southern section of the west exterior face of the Gate of Hadrian, is the longest Demotic inscription, Egyptian or Nubian. It is among many Nubian inscriptions on this exterior western wall of the Gate of Hadrian, and also accompanied by numerous figural graffiti, including two that I'm showing here, identified by Cruz Uribe as Sasan, the author of this inscription, Feli 416. So he's shown on the upper right of the screen with his staff. And then Tekora de Amani, the Marowitic king whom Sasan served, is shown on the left holding an Ankh sign with a barely legible Demotic inscription in front of him. So the translation of this long text, I'll read you out several sections because it's very informative. I'm using a translation by Jeremy Pope in Encoria 31 from 2008. So the first section I'd like to read out, quote, I came to Egypt, this is Sasan, I came to Egypt that I might perform the rites that my Lord had ordered for me. I performed them. He had also ordered me to count the money, 10 talents, and to bring them to the temple compound of Isis for the Hemnecher priest, the Wab priest, and the daughters of the Wab priest. So this is a clear statement of Merowitic royal financial support directly given to priests at the temple complex of Feli, and might also indicate a ritual role for the daughters of the Wab priests. Second quote refers to Tekora de Amani, the Merowitic king, quote, he had ordered me to let the whole nome enjoy itself, and we did that in his good name. So this is that epic party that I was referring to that would have occurred on the forecourt of the temple at Feli. Quote, he ordered the king's son and the Karens of Isis to come to Egypt with me until we had performed the festivals and banquets which were celebrated in the temple compound of Isis. We made our burnt offerings in return for the breath of life for the Pharaoh, Tekora de Amani, my Lord. And so this refers to specific rites that were performed by lower Nubian priests. So again, these priests whose home is in Sayalas, so just immediately south of the entrance to the Wadi Alaki that leads out to the gold mines in the Eastern Desert. These local lower Nubian priests are hired and sent to perform rites on behalf of the Marowitic king, precisely because they are able to read and write hieroglyphic Egyptian and Demotic, as well as Merowitic. So they're trilingual. And because they are trained as priests, they're able to properly conduct the rites within the Egyptian temples of Lower Nubia. In this case, in phase 2, Nubians are now acting at Feli in a Merowitic controlled context as employees and ritual specialists on behalf of the king in Maraway. Another quote from this very long inscription. Beautiful were the honors which the Hemnecher priest and the Wab priest and the populace of the town performed for me, Sasan, until they brought us to the temple compound of Isis. And this indicates the warm and respectful reception by the resident priest at Feli for the Nubian priest arriving from the south. One more long quote from this inscription. We sent another quantity of gold and made them into a libation jar of gold, which we furnished with the name of our Lord. The aforementioned gold amounting to 4.5 litras. Waiakia A, the strategist of the water, had 2 litras of gold brought and they were made into a golden sistrum to be raised before Isis on the 3 decades. Sasan, together with Karen, his brother, too, had 1 litra of gold, and we made it into a large Hess vessel for making libations to Osiris Whenefer, the great god. From the first day of the 4th month of inundation, Koyak, until the first day of the 3rd month of winter, we celebrated in the temple compound of Isis, together with our brethren, the Karens of Isis, the Hemnecher priest, and the priest on duty among the Wab priests. We passed 8 days dining on the dromos of Isis on wine, beer, and meat, while the populace of the town in its entirety was in jubilation and making obeisance to the pharaoh. So this details something like 16.5 pounds of gold that were brought with this one delegation from Maraway, and the offering of this gold at the temple of Feli and its working into specific cultic items right there at the temple. I have identified the interior of the 2nd pylon as the place where these golden implements were stored. Virtually all of the inscriptions written by goldsmiths at Feli line the walls of the internal stairs of this pylon. So it was the milk libation rite more than anything that drew Nubian inscriptions during this 2nd phase. This milk libation rite, deemed anomalous in the Egyptian context, is shown in each of these images where a king is pouring milk over an offering table, for example here, that has on either side of it the loop-handled situli that are used to indicate that this is a milk libation rite. 2 Marowitic kings performed the rite at Dhaka and Dabod. So here we see the Merowitic king Arkamani II, and then below his successor Adi Kalamani performing this milk libation rite. Well, on the upper right, we see Ptolemy VIII making that same rite, pouring milk from a loop-handled situla here, and unfortunately, the offering table has been removed, but he's making this rite before Osiris and Isis. I don't know if you can see here, there are a couple of Nubian inscriptions right in front of their faces, while the hieroglyphic text behind the king make clear that this is milk that is being poured out. This rite in the Nubian context was required to be performed for Osiris at Feli in order to assure his resurrection. These scenes do not appear in temples north of Feli. And as I said, the Nubian inscriptions tended to cluster around these milk libation scenes. So here's another one from the north interior wall of the Gate of Hadrian. Hard to see the king here, one Roman ruler performing the same milk libation rite, the loop-handled situla, and then Osiris and Isis. And there are several Nubian inscriptions in that vicinity as well. So I make the assertion that this milk libation is a Nubian rite. I follow in the research of Hermann Juncker, who identified these milk libation scenes at Feli, Dhaka, and Kalabsha. And then Janice Yellen followed up on that research to identify similar scenes on Marowitic funerary chapel walls and offering tables. So here is an image from a Merowitic funerary chapel in which we see Anubis and Nephthys pouring that same milk libation rite, same pair performing the rite on the Marowitic offering tables here, as well as on a doorpost from Sadinga. And this is a Merowitic language milk offering formula identified by Cloud Ree. I have proposed that these so-called anomalous milk libation scenes were in fact traditional Nubian funerary rites that were introduced into the temples of the Dodekaskoinos by the Nubian priests. And you can find that information in this article that I had published in Near Eastern Archaeology in the fall of last year. Okay, so Horus of Coubon. I'd like to just point out first that this is the relief panel I'll be talking about, but that it is immediately to the right of the panel I just showed you of Ptolemy VIII pouring milk libations for Osiris and then Isis here. And then to the right of this scene, again, are those stairs leading up into the interior of the second pylon. So here's the hieroglyphic text that identifies this deity in the relief as Hor Baktet, Horus of Coubon. It seems that this was the local god of this prominent Waiakia family. As I've mentioned several times, their home, Sayala, is just south of the Wadi Alaki, leading into that gold mining area of the Eastern Desert. And a Middle Kingdom temple dedicated to Horus is located there on the eastern bank at the mouth of the Wadi Alaki, Dhaka temple being on the opposite bank of the Nile. So in this image, Horus of Coubon is being offered by Ptolemy VIII again. And you can see here two Nubian inscriptions written in Demotic, the one on the top, and then a dividing line and a second inscription. So here is a translation of this graffito Feli 251. It's the earliest inscription by a Waiakia family member, so Paese A'a. Identified here was the first of 7 generations of Waiakia family members who left inscriptions here at Feli. I'd like to point out that he addresses Isis as giver of life. Apparently this epithet is unique in the Nubian context. And he says, I cry out to you, rescue. And this verb for the crying out or calling out in Demotic is shalel. And so that's what gives the title to my book, Calling Out to Isis. This verb is only used in the Nubian inscriptions at Feli. So the second inscription just below it is long, and I'm not going to read the whole text, but it's interesting that it has a colophon by a man named Abarita, who identifies himself as a goldsmith. In fact, son of a goldsmith for 303 generations, to imply that this is a family craft. And I'd like just to point out that his name, Abarita, the first part, Abar, in Marowitic means man. And then finally, just below these other inscriptions is Feli 253, which belongs to the third phase of the Nubian inscriptions, which shows the enduring appeal of this area for Nubian worshipers. In fact, all of the Christians who left inscriptions and identified themselves as Nubian, Nuba, there's a whopping 2 or 3 of them, but it's interesting that they chose to engrave their inscriptions on or near these 2 relief panels in the southwest corner of the pronaos of the main temple. So phase 3 of the Nubian inscriptions, we actually have precise dates for this phase. So from 408 to 456 CE. You can see that the inscriptions had by this late date penetrated much further into the temple, which says to me that the local Egyptian priests were probably no longer carrying out the full cult on behalf of the goddess Isis. I'll just point out here that there's a collection of Demotic and Greek inscriptions on the roof of the main temple, and they are engraved on or near the Osiris chambers located on the roof. So this continues to be a focus of the Nubian cult at Feli to perform rites for the resurrection of Osiris. But also here on the roof of the birth house, there are several inscriptions in Demotic, but also Marowitic, and accompanying the image of feet. Perhaps these priests had retreated to the roof to avoid conflict with Christians who are attested on the island of Feli from as early as 330 CE. And so it seems Christians and traditional practitioners shared this island for about 100 years. And there's the remnants of an installation of a Christian altar here in the Pronaos. And so this would probably have been contested space. The worshipers during this phase were Blemis, those residents of the Eastern Desert who had moved into Lower Nubia. And they were the ones who then funded these priests to arrive at Feli to perform rites. Okay. The Nubian presence at Feli is not limited to the 500 years in which Nubian prayer inscriptions were engraved at these Egyptian temples in the Dodocaskoinos. The 25th dynasty Kushite king Taharka's monuments are actually the oldest monuments attested at Feli, and they were dedicated to the worship of the god Amun, a god closely associated with kingship in Kush. Merowitic rulers were active in the temples of Lower Nubia during the Theban revolt, 206 to 186 BCE. So we have several attestations of involvement in temple decoration and construction by Arkamani II and his successor, Adi Kalamani, including a fascinating top half of a stela that was found buried under the Pronaos and discovered when the temple of Feli was dismantled to move it. Later Marowitic rulers inscribed their cartouches at the Temple of Dhaka in the 1st century BCE. So we have the names of Queen Amanitore, King Teritakas, and the Prince Akinidad. And these three rulers were prolific builders in the heartland of Maraway. So it's interesting to see that their range of control had stretched up to the Temple of Dhaka during this period. And then the last inscription was made in the name of the king Yesbok Heamani, who was the penultimate ruler of Maraway. And he left 2 Marowitic language inscriptions, again, no surprise, in the Gate of Hadrian. They are on the north and the south wall, so paired inscriptions in which he gives his name and claims the title of king, Quare in Merowitic, and relays some type of title that is not yet translatable, but related to Isis, who is called Wos in Merowitic. So this records 1,000 years of Nubian presence at Feli, beginning before the worship of Isis was introduced under Psammetichus II of the 26th dynasty, and therefore renders Feli as a Nubian sacred space. Thank you very much for your attention.
Oh, thank you very much. And before we get to the questions, I do just want to draw everybody's attention to the Q&A button. So please feel free to shoot us any questions there. So we're going to start. I have a question from Charles. Before the pandemic, did you and your students perform archaeological fieldwork at Nubian sites? If yes, do you plan on going back after the pandemic?
Okay, interesting question. Here I confess that I am not an archaeologist. I was just hosted on that excavation in Sudan. I am an Egyptologist, so I focus on the language, various language phases in Egypt. And so I was supposed to be going to Egypt multiple times this year, and because of the pandemic, everything has canceled. I would love to get back to Egypt, and especially to bring students to show them the Nubian presence at Feli, but also at Kalabsha and Dhaka, which are accessible as well. Finally, I should point out for those in New York, there is a Nubian temple, Dendor, in the Metropolitan Museum. And in fact, one of the inscriptions, this is from that earliest phase, phase 1, is the one and only inscription in the temple. And if you've been there, they allow you to enter just into the entryway of the temple. And if you look up on the right-hand side, you'll see something like 7 lines of Demotic. So that's another one of these Nubian inscriptions.
We actually next have 2 questions relating to milk. Charles asked, why was milk more sacred to Nubians compared to Egyptians? And then actually we have another follow-up question from Elizabeth Bowman on, can you say a little bit more about the milk ritual?
Absolutely, yes. So I'm convinced that milk was held as sacred by the Nubians because of the prominence of the cattle culture there. We see that very early in that first capital of Kush, Kerma, where the rulers are buried with hundreds and hundreds of bucrania. And in fact, the poster behind me is from an exhibit in Switzerland about the kings of Kerma. But this continues down through the C group people who are cattle pastoralists. We see that they are wearing leather garments. They're buried on leather mats. Everything is about the cattle. This continues in the Napatan period. So the 25th dynasty Egyptian rulers of Egypt, I should say, come out of this Napatan period. And there are temple inscriptions there in which those kings in Napatan temples are talking about donating, offering to the god Amun at his temple, hundreds of longhorn cattle, gold milk vessels. And so this is very much associated with the prominence and importance of cattle pastoralism. And the milk is held to be a sacred substance. We see this further down into East Africa. Other groups where milk and beer are both held to have ritual significance. And so I think tapping into these other African ritual significances for these substances brings a lot to the discussion of why milk was so essential. Of course, it's associated with the breast milk that a mother gives to her new baby. And so we know in the Egyptian tradition that the resurrection after death is seen to be a second birth. And so milk is part also in the Egyptian context of coronation for the king, but also as an offering to be reborn in the afterlife. I think it's the centrality of this cattle culture. There's an image, I wish I had included it on the slide here, of a bronze bowl that was excavated at the site of Karanog a Nubian center of power near Qasr Ibrim. And this bowl is decorated around the rim with an image of a woman sitting in front of a conical hut, topped by an ostrich egg. She is seated on the ground, topless, with her young daughter behind her. Five probably similar bronze bowls are set out in front of her, and a man very regally is pouring milk into the bowls from cattle who decorate the rest of the bowl. The milk has obviously been freshly taken from these cows. So it's just interwoven in everything in the Nubian culture. And for the Marowitic royalty, it was understood as an essential part of revivifying, bringing back to life the deceased ruler. And I want to stress here in Merroway that could either be a sole ruling king or a sole ruling queen. And so many of the funerary chapels that are appended to the east side of the royal burials in Maraway are decorated with scenes of this milk libation rite. And you can look to Janice Yellen's article for more specific data about that. And I also talk about that a lot in my book.
Right, we have a question from Steve Harvey. How can we understand the interaction between Demotic inscriptions and Meroritic ones in the Gate of Hadrian?
Interesting. Yes, so there's a lot of overlap between the two. It's the same players, predictably members of this Waiakia family, who are mentioned in both types of inscriptions, in the Demotic language inscriptions and the Marowitic language inscriptions. We see similar titles used in both of the inscriptions. For example, Karen of Isis, which is still not 100% translatable, but the writing in Demotic is determined by a hieroglyph referring to writing. So certainly some sort of scribal or literate priestly position is rendered as Koran in the Merowitic language, which is interesting. It might somehow relate to this word Kore that refers to the king, the title held by the ruling king in Merreway. The positioning of the inscriptions is interesting as well. They're often right next to each other. On that exterior face of the western face of the Gate of Hadrian, I believe all of those inscriptions are written in either Demotic or Greek. And it's interesting, they seem to be paired. Two different embassies that came from Maraway in 253. Thank you, Sasan, for actually putting a date on that inscription, Feli 416. And then another embassy came 7 years later. And that inscription is Feli 417, inscribed by a man named Tommy. But there are also then two paired Greek inscriptions that refer to these high-ranking men. Abratoya, who was mentioned in Sasan's inscription, leaves his own Greek language inscription on the Gate of Hadrian. And then in the interior of the temple, which of course is decorated with that amazing Abaton decree on the north wall that is in hieroglyphic text, we see Thoth, the Egyptian Thoth, who is recording Ra's decree that milk libation should be brought every day to the burial of Osiris on the Abaton, Biga Island. And then all around there, we have Demotic language inscriptions. Also those two Merowitic language inscriptions of the king Yesbok Heyamani, who has usurped an image of the king with a big cartouche in front of him that only includes the hieroglyphs to read Per Aa, Pharaoh. And so, yes, Bokeh Amani has written just above the image of that king presenting fields. He's written his 2 or 3 line Marowitic language inscription. So they're very much in conversation with each other. We see these triliterate priests, trilingual priests sort of flexing, if you will. They're leaving inscriptions in Marowitic, which tend to be quite a bit briefer than the Demotic ones, which are known for their length and their passion. And then also writing in Greek. And Greek seems to have been chosen by the high-ranking political emissaries of the Merowitic king, because they would have been conducting political negotiations with the Roman rulers in Egypt in Greek, which was then the diplomatic language. So I hope I've answered your question, Steve.
Similar, talking about Greek, we have a question on the origin of the name of Isis. Is that Greek?
No. Oh, I mean, the version Isis is certainly comes into English from the way that the Greeks would have interpreted the Egyptian word Aset, right? Which, as you may or may not know, is just written in the hieroglyphic script by that a throne. So Aset is the Egyptian word, and then we know the Merowites heard and wrote that same name for Isis as Wos, W-O-S. So this may give us some idea of how the name was actually pronounced in this period of the late 2nd through the 3rd century CE.
A new question from Anne. Do you have any idea how long it took for the Nubian priests to sail from Maraway to Feli?
No, I don't. That's a good question, because it leads me to talk a little bit more about the multiple ways that they may have arrived at Feli. And so certainly that undated Greek inscription records the majestic arrival of the Nubian ships. But Sasan, in his really long Demotic graffito, also talks about his perilous journey, which Jeremy Pope has interpreted the Demotic to allude to a crossing from the 4th cataract up to the Nile in Lower Nubia on the Korosko Road. So I would encourage you to go take a look at that article. There were multiple ways that they could have arrived at Feli, but honestly, no, I'm not certain. I do know that, for example, now this is outside of this talk, but Bianchi in his Victory Stela talks about coming down into Egypt with the inundation, and that certainly would have sped up the journey and made them arrive faster.
We have a question from Christina, which I think you've already answered this. For the milk ritual, what type of milk was used?
Certainly cattle milk. And let me see if oh, sorry. No, I was trying to see somewhere I had included, yes, there it is. On the upper left, this is another one of those figural graffito that decorate and actually cover this exterior face of the Gate of Hadrian. And I love this image because it is showing us Isis in her cow form being transported on this boat from Feli over to Biga Island, which it's not far at all, but this was a ritual procession which would have taken place. And I love that here on the left is a little ritual jar, so we can understand that the milk would have been transferred into this jar to then be poured out on the 365 offering tables that were decreed by Ra should stand there at the burial of Osiris. So very much it was cow milk that was being offered, but we are to understand it ritually as the breast milk that comes from Isis, in much the same way that she's shown nursing Horus in the birth house. And on the exterior rear wall of the birth house, you can see cow goddesses who are bringing milk to the nursing mother, Isis, as she's nursing her son, Horus. This breast milk of Isis is taken to be the ritual fluid that will ensure the revivification of Osiris as Osiris Wennefer, beautiful of form. And that on this panel, it's that image to the left, the milk is being described as was, so powerful, nejum as sweet, and hedjet as gleaming or white. And so this is held as a sacred substance and potent to both bring forth, bring into life and strength Horus as the son of Isis, but Osiris as the deceased spouse of Isis. And that's why I think in the Nubian inscriptions, this epithet of Isis as giver of life is so central. And it only appears in these Nubian temples. It's the magical ability of Isis to not only bring forth her son, but to sustain him with her breast milk and to bring back to life her deceased husband with the same liquid.
Have a question from Paul. What was the effect of the Maraway and Roman border raids in the 1st century BC on Feli and the tributes from Meroe to the Temple of Isis?
Yeah, so there were a couple of battles in 29 BCE and then again in 25 BCE. The Romans, after conquering Egypt, attempted to push south into Nubia, and they were met in battle by, Strabo tells us, this mannish, one-eyed queen who was one of many Kandakas, these powerful ruling queens from Maraway. She actually led her Marowitic troops in battle against the Romans. And although the Romans, of course, claimed victory, like you do in your own text, it seems that they were repelled for a time. Of course, they came back later. But so there was battle back and forth trying to determine who was going to control this area of the Dodocaskoinos, because the Marowitic rulers already controlled Marowitic Nubia, so up to Kasser Ibrim, maybe a little bit further north, but they were now battling control for northern lower Nubia. We do see two rulers buried at Jebel Barkal during this period. Everybody else was buried down in Maraway, but we see two queens buried up at Jebel Barkal, which seems to perhaps indicate the Merowitic forces, rulers, doubling down on fighting to control this area. So I guess the follow-up to that is by around, 298, we're told that Diocletian pulls back any attempt at Egyptian control of Lower Nubia, and he brings the border to Aswan. But as the inscriptions of Sasan and all of these other Nubian priests in 250, 260, 270 CE let us know, the Merowites were in actual physical control of the temples of Lower Nubia. Tommy in his Demotic inscription, Feli 417, tells us that he crowns a prophet, that he is putting bark on the boat of Isis, that he has planted Persea trees at the temple of Feli, and that he has chased off men from Elephantine who were trying to go to the Abaton. And so he really is positioned there in this particular inscription, claiming the title of tax collector, which probably means he's the Lasonus of the temple. He's the financial overseer of the temple, and he is establishing and claiming dominance over this space to the extent that he's calling in the Roman ducks, and he is having the men from Elephantine who are trying to go to visit the burial of Osiris on the Abaton, he's having them expelled. So for this period in the mid-3rd century, it is definitely a Marowitic controlled sacred space.
We have a question from Barbara, who's from the North California chapter, who said how she's been to Sudanese Nubia. And she's wondering about how much about the Merowitic language do we know?
Good question. Thank you, Barbara. So Griffith, who of course collected all of the inscriptions at Feli in that Demotic, a catalog of Demotic inscriptions of the Dodecus Koinos, also wrote 2 volumes called Marowitic Inscriptions, something longer. So he was the first to figure out the correspondence of Merowitic hieroglyphs and the cursive Merowitic. So let me just back up a little and say both of these scripts were derived and developed out of the Egyptian scripts, but they're using them in a very different way. So Merowitic hieroglyphs and the cursive script developed out of Demotic scrapped the very complex writing system of ancient Egypt and instead create an alphabet. And so it's much simpler. There's something like 30 letters, something like that. And this is in fact an alpha syllabary, which means that it writes consonants, consonants. And there is an assumed vowel A after every consonant. So kandaka, for example, unless indicated by another character that would indicate E, an I, or an O. All that to say that we are not much further than where Griffith got in 1911, I think, which is that we have identified these, the equivalences of these 30 or so alphabetic characters, but we cannot read very many words. I should give the background that the Marowitic language and the Nubian language both belong to a larger African language family called Nilo-Saharan. They're part of the Northeast Sudanic branch of this larger African language. And so quite different than Egyptian, which belongs to the Afro-Asiatic language family, along with Cushitic languages like Beja, spoken by the Blemi people, or Agao, spoken by people in Ethiopia, or even Ethiopic, which is a Semitic language. All of those languages belong to Afro-Asiatic, and Merowitic and Nubian are belonging to Nilo-Saharan, which is a language family that goes all the way down the Nile, as far south as Uganda. For example, Maasai language is part of this larger Nilo-Saharan language family. So it's very different. As Egyptologists, you know, we tend not to know a lot about the rest of Africa, and that leaves us not able to get very far with translating and understanding Merowitic. So a lot more work needs to be done on the related languages from this language family of Nilo-Saharan to be able to really crack Marowitic. And it's fascinating. I am working with a group that's trying to preserve Nubian languages. And so we're working with speakers of Nubian and Ajang, Kordofan Nubian. I'm in touch with some folks, Nara speakers in Western Eritrea. And so I think in pulling in an understanding of these living languages, as Claude Ree has attempted to do, that's how we're going to be able to get a bit further in understanding Merowitic. At this point, what we can understand is terms for family relationships. So from the funerary monuments written in the Merowitic language. So someone, I would say, for example, I am Solange, born of, and I will name my mother. The Nubians always name their mother first, sometimes to the exclusion of the father. When the father's mentioned, he comes second. And so I am sired by my father's name. There's another very important term called yet mede, is the Merowitic term, and we're still not quite sure what that means, but it definitely positions the speaker or the writer of this funerary text in relation to other members of his or her society. And so I think Claude Ree has translated it as uncle or niece and nephew, but I think it's something more than that. It's positioning that person in a network of an extended family that comes from a clan lineage that is the organizing principle of Nubian society. And so we see that still with modern Nubians, Nubian speakers talking about the different kinship terms that are used in Nubian. And here I will recommend an article by Nubian Toad Khalil called Maternalism in Nubian that talks about the centrality of the mother and how every other family relationship is based on how that person is connected to the mother of the family.
I think on a very similar note, we have a question about the best way to find out more about Meroritic language in general.
Yeah, yes. Oh my gosh, so it's Griffith, and Griffith to start. If you can get your hands on Francis L. Griffith's Marowitic Inscriptions, volumes 1 and 2. He writes a lot in there. He also has chapters in the Eckley B. Cox publication from Penn for their excavation at Caranog, where he's doing a lot of early language analysis. There's also a 6-part journal article series, and I'm blanking on where that's from. But then in the modern era, there's a couple of books and then a series of articles by Claude Ree. His last name is spelled R-I-L-L-Y. Many of them are in French. But there are some that are written in English that are more accessible. And I guess as a final recommendation, the Marowitic newsletter is available for free online. And so you can just scroll through all of the articles on there. They're not specific only about language analysis, but you will find some top tier language analysis by scholars in the field. And I guess finally, the Center of Merowitic Language Studies, as far as I understand, is in Berlin. So I hope to get there at one point, yes.
A question from Virginia on why was Feli Temple built where it was? And follow up, why is there also a temple to the goddess Hathor at Feli?
Mm-hmm. Okay, good question, and something I forgot to mention when I was showing you those initial images of Philae. It's on an island. It is just south of the First Cataract, which was the traditional border between Egypt and Nubia. So Philae on its island is properly in Nubia. And the temple, unlike most Egyptian temples, which face east to the rising sun, is facing south. And I think this is noteworthy. And I interpret that as sort of welcoming or looking toward the Nubians who would be arriving by boat or overland, as they were the bulk of the visitors to this temple over time. Why was it built there? Also an interesting question. One of the upsides of having to dismantle and move the temple in advance of the flooding of Nubia is that we got to see underneath the standing temple originally built, that main temple by Ptolemy II, so very early in the Ptolemaic period. But underneath that is a very small temple that sits where the pronaos of the main temple to Isis is now. And that was built by Psammiticus II, also dedicated to the goddess Isis. And apparently it was situated on a small rock outcropping on the island, so a high space, if you will. What I didn't mention, in addition to that bark stand of Taharka that we see in that interior courtyard at Philae, part of the dismantling of the temple for the move revealed also building blocks featuring Taharka with his name in a cartouche, worshiping the god Amun. So clearly there were buildings on the site that were dismantled when the 26th dynasty was following up, pushing out the Kushite rulers of the 25th dynasty. They wanted to sort of erase all evidence of a Kushite presence there and start fresh with the goddess Isis. So now to the question about why is there a temple of Hathor there? This is also a really good question. There are multiple temples on the island of Philae. That one for Isis is, of course, the main temple, but along the forecourt are those temples to the Nubian gods and also the god Imhotep. And then the temple of Hathor is located to the east side of the main temple for Isis. There's also a small temple for Hor-Pakhered, just north of the gate of Hadrian. So a whole temple complex here. But these Nubian gods and Hathor, to me, are all representatives of this myth of the distant goddess that talks about Hathor raging in Nubia, and we're told specific locales in Nubia, Knesset and Bugam. She's down there raging because humanity has dared to rise up against her father, the sun god Re. And Re decides to send two other gods to bring her back to Egypt. In the traditional Egyptian telling, that's Shu and Onuris who are sent to go and get the goddess. But in the Temple of Philae, we see a much more Nubian version of this tale, especially in the decoration of that forecourt area. So it is Arens-Nufis and Thoth-Panubs who are sent down to Nubia to bring back this raging goddess, Tefnut. And so they ply her with wine, they speak sweet words to her, they play music for her. And as she becomes very drunk, she becomes more compliant, and they are able to lead her back to Philae Temple. And we're told from inscriptions from, for example, the temple at Medamud, that this procession of the goddess being brought back from Nubia was accompanied by specific Nubian tribes who are named by name. Those hieroglyphic inscriptions at Metamud tell us what their attire was, how their king was looking, the dances that they performed. So this is part of this annual procession of the goddess Tefnut coming back, accompanied by various groups of Nubians to arrive at the temple of Feli and partake in rites on that dromos again. So here's the epic partying, right? And so the goddess Isis, she is of love, sexuality, music, dance, divine drunkenness, all of that. So as Tefnut arrives to Feli, she is told, the text in this area of the dromos tell us that she bathes in the cool waters of Feli and the flames of her wrath are extinguished. So in this moment, she transforms into Hathor, and then the party begins. So there is music, dancing, all kinds of drinking, and probably a lot of sexuality as well. And we see in that temple, the Hathor temple at Feli, images of baboons playing guitars or playing flutes and people dancing. And so it's very much associated with the myth of the distant goddess and the return of Hathor from Nubia. That was a long answer. I hope I got everything that you asked.
We have another Isis question. If you can compare the Nubian conception of Isis to that of the Egyptian.
Okay, good. Let's see, I guess most basically the depiction of her is quite different. In Feli, for example, she has the typical svelte goddess form, Egyptian form. And when we see her, for example, depicted on the exterior wall of the Marowitic temple at Naka, she's considerably thicker. And so she's looking not quite as thick and voluptuous as the Merowitic queens portray themselves, but she is noticeably thicker than her Egyptian equivalent. She has a little bit of the warrior goddess to her. In that same image from Naka, she is shown clasping enemies by the hair and presenting them to the king and queen. But she also holds in her other hand a situla, and that is a clear reference to these milk libation rites that are also associated with her. So she seems in Maraway to fill this slot in the funerary ritual. So she is really primarily associated with funerary rites, where Hathor then is much more associated with the ruling queen and being paired with the Marowitic king. So the ruling queen is seen as a manifestation of Hathor. I think that's all I have for Isis.
And another question on the situla that you just mentioned. Is it always and only associated with milk?
It is in the Nubian context. I know that that is different in the Egyptian context, but when we see it in the Nubian connection, it is very specifically connected with these funerary milk libation rites. And we see Anubis and Nephthys holding it very clearly by that loop handle. Whoops, trying to see if, oh, never mind. Yes, it's very specifically associated with the milk libation rites.
We have a question from Sid, who says, much of your talk falls in the Roman period, but you spoke of no inscriptions in Latin. Is that just an artifact of Nubian schooling, or was Latin just not used anywhere in Egypt?
good question, Sid. There are Latin inscriptions at Feli. There actually, I think, is a Latin inscription at Naka, in Maraway, way down in Maraway, if I remember correctly. But it is definitely in the minority. It was not seen, I think, as appropriate for prayer inscriptions in this temple context. And we should remember that Greek was introduced as the sort of language of rulers during the Ptolemaic period, but the Roman rulers, upon conquering Egypt, just continued to use Greek as well. And so Latin just doesn't appear that much in Egypt, even in the Roman period. So if you think, for example, of the Rosetta Stone, we have hieroglyphs and then Demotic and then Greek, and no Latin is appearing there. I think the few Latin inscriptions at Feli appear on the top eastern face of the birth house, and those are sort of official Roman rulers leaving texts in Latin, but it just doesn't appear much.
We have a question on if you know where Isis is said to have been buried.
No. No, I have no information about that. And that may have something to do with the fact that in Egyptian mythology, Isis never dies. She's the eternal goddess, and part of her role, not all of her role, but part of her role is tending to her deceased spouse and ensuring that he is perpetually regenerated. So it just doesn't enter into Egyptian mythology to even talk about the burial of this goddess who is conceived of as eternal.
And the last question, is the prominence of Nubian maternal kingship related to the cattle milk culture?
Yes, but maybe vice versa. I think that first and foremost, that this was a value of the people of the Middle Nile Valley, and I should say over much of Africa, that the role of the mother and her ability to bring forth life and to continue the life of the population was revered, and she's seen as central to society. So that came first in Nubian culture, and then perhaps by comparison, the role of the cow, how she could not only maintain her calf and her young, but also provided milk for the entire population of cattle herders, that became then associated to the ability of women to bring forth life, to give life in that same way that the Nubian epithet for Isis recalls her as the one who gives life.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your presentation and for answering all those questions. And lastly, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. And we very much hope to see you at our next open lecture on September 13th. So have a good evening, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you all.